I'd also like to acknowledge that we're here on Aboriginal ground and thank the guys from Creative Mornings for having us along here, and just acknowledge that this has always, forever been and will be Aboriginal country. Design and ugliness. I'm going to skate pretty lightly over the ugly theme. Maybe we can come back to that briefly in the Q&A. But just for those of you who don't know that much about me, I trained as a graphic designer. I studied at the Curtin School of Design and graduated in 1991. And there are some really wonderful people there, some of whom I've stayed in contact with for a period of time. And keep in mind, this is kind of the pre-desktop publishing, as it was called then, days, certainly pre-internet. And I didn't really get it. I didn't really enjoy commercial art all that much, certainly not learning about that stuff. I only studied graphic design because I couldn't work out at the time what the hell else to do. And so while I really enjoyed learning about illustration and typography and doing it kind of the old-fashioned way by hand, because of course there were just no Macs in those days, and I'm dating myself a little bit here, the idea of sort of turning my head to commercial art didn't really do it for me, and I kind of found myself a little bit in my own world, even at that stage, kind of designing games and often my own little flights of fancy for a period of time. And then I think kind of halfway through third year, the first lab full of Macs arrived, and I got to see a very early build of Photoshop and thought, holy shit, this changes everything. You know, this is going to make things possible that you can't do with paste up and Letraset. Again, dating myself a little bit. So I worked for 5 or 6 years in small studios and was given a really good start in, as I guess a lot of us have done if you work in Perth in the design field or in many other fields. You'll end up working in mining or in oil and gas or for the chemical industry. So I had a really good start in small studios working for large clients, in some instances making ugly things look great, and in some instances just kind of perfecting a craft or doing process design work or that kind of stuff. But kind of got increasingly dissatisfied over a period of 6 or 7 years and ended up in a little studio that was working mostly for the resource industry. Again, really decent people doing a good job, but it kind of wasn't cutting it. And at the point where the studio got an account with CRA, as it was called at the time, that was developing the Kintyre uranium mine in the northeast goldfields, or the central Pilbara, I cut away, quit my job, sold my car, and started a little design studio with a couple of friends. And our first client was Mountain Designs, the camping and outdoor company. And they, in an act of extraordinarily reckless generosity, gave us studio space up the back of the Mountain Design store on Hay Street, in exchange for which we would design for them a website, back when that was 2 words. We taught ourselves how to write HTML by hand in 1995 when the web was first emerging, and again it was another one of those light bulb moments, because before then, World Wide Web age, the internet was something that you used a command line interface to go and drag back photographs from a NASA archive in California, and it was still remarkable, but it wasn't particularly friendly. I'm not a programmer and have never really understood how the guts of the machine works, but you get this web platform that can throw up photographs, or you can actually start to bring a bit of a design aesthetic to material that's being fetched from servers on the other side of the planet in real time. Again, it was a bit of a moment of, oh, this really changes everything. This is remarkable. Not so much that the platform exists, but that basically a couple of kids in space up the back of Hay Street could teach ourselves not just how to read this material, but how to write it and publish it. And that act of distributed, unregulated publication, I still think is one of the most precious qualities of the medium. So that lasted a couple of years, running a small business and getting a sense of how bloody hard that is, and congratulations for all of you who are in small business and are surviving, no matter what the pressures. Again, though, it was still commercial art, and even though we were working for outdoor companies and doing stuff that was a lot more satisfying, it still wasn't syncing or gelling with stuff that I was reading about in the paper or even in popular science magazines or developing an interest in systems theory, and kind of laterally or subliminally, I guess, developing an interest in politics. And the big break or breach for me was right at the very end of 1997. This is only, I think, a matter of probably not even a year after the Howard government had been elected and announced that every neighbourhood was going to get a uranium mine. There'd be 25 around the country, and the first one was going to be at a place called Jabiluka in Kakadu National Park. And it was a bit like a fuse blowing. At that stage, I was freelancing, had a couple of good clients, and had found myself in a place where I could work intensively for a period of weeks or months on a particular account, and then actually skive off, and the lights have gone out. Skive off, avoid paying tax for a period of time, and just kind of make do and scrounge. Thank you, whoever's working the lights. No, it's okay. Thank you for getting back. So I can still remember it very clearly at the beginning of 1998, going for a meeting at the office of the then North Metro MLC Giz Watson, kind of uninvited and unannounced and a bit inappropriate, because it was a meeting of the peak bodies and all these environment groups working out what we could do down here in WA to support the mob in Kakadu who didn't want this uranium mine built on top of their heads. I just kind of rolled up and said, God, you guys need some help with your design, Jesus Christ. What? Bit arrogant, actually, but you know, what can I do? And I walked out with a CD full of images and research, and basically just jumped in with both feet and never looked back. And for me, it was a really wonderful experience, because the Perth Enviro community is small, it's quite family based, it's not big and balkanised like Melbourne or Sydney, and it's actually something quite precious going on here, and I think it's one of the reasons. For example, you know, we elected a senator for nuclear disarmament, the first time that had happened anywhere in the world, here in Western Australia 31 years ago this year. And there's always been that quite, even though it's a resource-based economy, and it reminds me a little bit of Tassie with the polarisation between forestry and the greenies, it's a little bit similar here, I think, in WA, and I'm not quite sure why it is, but the place has a really strong and bolshy dissident undercurrent, and it's kind of wonderful. And I think it shapes the arts community as well, and maybe it's the isolation that breeds that, same as it does for the arts and music community here in WA. Either way, it was a bit of a fuse-blowing moment, seeing firsthand and being privileged enough to travel up to Kakadu at the end of 1998, having kind of used my design skills during the year, putting a website up for the groups that I was working with, helping with just really basic stuff, leaflets, posters, how do you present research in a way that, you know, a community that's jaded, really busy, probably not that interested, might be able to take some stuff away and have their lives changed the way that mine had been. And if you want to talk ugliness, if you can visualize just for a moment the concept of one of the largest open-cut uranium mines in the world, blasted out of a World Heritage Area in Kakadu National Park, expressly against the wishes of the people who've lived there for 40 or 50,000 years, was one of the ugliest things that I'd ever seen. So as a designer, my challenge was, how do I turn that catastrophe and kind of quite urgent need for mobilisation and help through design tools into something that is motivating rather than demotivating. And it's something that the environment movement, or people working on social justice campaigns, or groups like Amnesty working on really hardcore stuff, people being tortured in dismal parts of the world, how do we use communication skills and tools to turn something that could just have you fleeing for the door into something that instead says, how can I help? What can I do? And that, I guess, is probably something that's familiar to many of you in here if you found your way here this morning. In 1999, travelling to Jharsuguda in an area of India that is now called Jharkhand, one of the poorest parts of India, where the Indian uranium mining complex is. India has very poor low-grade uranium deposits, and they're all concentrated in this one area. And now it's surrounded by a circle of villages, because they didn't bother evacuating people, they just built this mining complex on top of them. There are villages full of deformed children and workers with hideous skin cancers and diseases that don't even have names. Again, how do we use design skills and design tools to communicate the changes that we want to see in the world? So I spent 3 or 4 years doing that, and the kind of final design project that I undertook during that sort of semi-autonomous part of my life, was a 25-minute short film called Climate of Hope. And the idea was to, because it was done on no budget at all, a little bit of support from John Butler and the JBC, as it was called then. The idea is to say, if I can drag your attention in for 25 minutes and make the case that the nuclear industry, sorry to go on about that a bit, but not only has no part in helping us get out of the mess that we're in with climate change and fossil fuel burning, but is actually would be a direct impediment to the kind of change that we need to see. Can we use animation, data visualization, and on zero budget at all? So there's almost no footage that was shot for the film, but it was almost all 3D animation and that kind of stuff. Can we use that as a bit of a teaching tool and something that will spread? And to our great delight, it actually worked really well. However, getting elected at the end of 2007 kind of really put a very abrupt end to that stage of my design work. And it did take a little bit of time to find my feet in politics. I was elected for the Australian Greens, for those of you who don't know me, in 1997, which was the same election as the end of the Howard government. So that was kind of a nice note to come in on, and the beginning of a rather confused and tortured period of Labor government under a rotating roster of different prime ministers. Found myself still needing to scratch the design itch, and I'm presuming it's the same for you in kind of whatever line of work you're in, that creative tendencies or creative imperative will surface whether you like it or not, and you've just got to find a way of dealing with it. And so I've kind of moving into that third phase from commercial art to trying to use design work to help activist movements and campaign movements, to trying to work out what design-led politics would look like. And maybe this is a question that I'll throw to you folks at the end, because I still haven't worked it out. But I think there's an interesting, not having a good answer is, for me, not as important as asking that question. What would design-led politics look like? Whatever your political affiliations or leanings, and I won't assume necessarily at all that that I'm speaking with a room full of greenies, I think most people would agree that politics in this day and age, it's good that we don't hack each other to death with machetes, and there are places that are where you can still be murdered for turning up and trying to vote. So not to be sitting up here and whinging because this is one of the safest places in the world to do politics, but also I think there's a general feeling and mood in the electorate that things are pretty just debased, and is this the best we can do? Politics by soundbite, by dismal repetition, by three-line slogans, by trying to win this really boring and debased nightly news cycle on TV. Really, can we do better? And because of my background, one of the answers among many that I guess I'm still playing with is that concept of design-led politics. So mashing up design skills and still a bit of an obsession and preoccupation with 3D modeling and rendering, data visualization, and being able to, I ran across this quote, and if anybody can tell me who it is, I'd love to know, that the function of the designer is to increase the legibility of the world. And the net cites 3 or 4 different people as having said it. I don't really care. The idea of the function of the designer being to increase the legibility I really love, because that's independent of your political leanings. It's like, what can we do to increase the legibility, including of some really pretty ugly stuff? Like we have initiated the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth. How can we increase the legibility of that and our role of that in a way that is motivating and empowering and creative and probably really beautiful and sad, again, without pushing people to disengage and pretend that it's not happening. And it means increasing the legibility of the possibility of change and the remarkably inspiring stuff that's going on all around us, including right here in our own backyard, to try and confront and avert the course of this sort of disaster that our economy is leading us into. And my other real love, I guess, that showed up during my second round of uni was postgrad studies in sustainability policy at Murdoch, was city policy. And so that has developed into a rather intense interest in urban design and the way that cities shape us as people, and the way that as people we shape cities. Because in my view, and maybe I'm wrong, but my instinct is that if we can solve cities, if we get cities right, we resolve a huge number of the issues that are confronting us at the moment. And it really surprised me because I wasn't expecting it. In cities, I found hope and optimism, both because at a political scale, we've got a lot more agency than we do at a national or a global level, but also because at the sort of local spatial scales, we can see people bringing quite design-led solutions to bear, or ecological designs to bear, in a way that actually resolves issues of overconsumption, water, energy, transport, this kind of stuff. And there are exquisite case studies around this country and around the world that we can be bringing to bear. So my current preoccupation of cities as our best hope means that in my the work that I do at the moment, a lot of it is presentation based, which was why it's an interesting challenge to just sit up here this morning without the crutch of a PowerPoint presentation and graphics flying around to kind of hopefully hypnotize you and persuade you of whatever the point is that I'm trying to make. But the idea that we can use design tools to increase the legibility of cities, and some of the solutions that we can bring to bear I actually find really compelling. So I do quite a bit of presentation work, like an hour or half an hour, leading people through how I kind of visualize or not just me, but the green movement in general, visualize the jam that we're in with an economy that either knows growth or collapse and doesn't seem to have a healthy path in the middle, and what kind of solutions that we can bring to bear as individuals, but also in our communities and our neighborhoods. And that's something that no matter how late at night it needs to happen, because actually I shouldn't really still be fooling around in 3D animators while holding a balance of power Senate office, I kind of can't help myself. And so this year and next year, what I'm hoping to be able to do is reboot this thing that we've designed, the working title being the WA 2.0 project, which, can I just get a really quick show of hands of who's heard of that before and has? Oh, that's kind of nice actually. More than zero. So ideally within 12 months time, if we come back, if I'm any good at my job, maybe 80 or 90% of the hands will go up and we can tease the 10% who haven't heard of it, rather than it being the other way around. So if you want to Google the WA 2.0 project, you'll see a very, very text-heavy research base on sustainability that's place-based, like how to reboot Perth and West Australia's regional areas for the 21st century so that they're fit for purpose and that we're not just going to plough into some kind of gruesome collapse. In the next 12 to 18 months or so, bringing a lot more of a design aesthetic to that so that it actually jumps off the page and is able to be communicated a lot better. So some of that stuff probably sounds a little bit technical, but I adore it and I can't help myself. But also, as I was kind of wrapping up this morning, I was thinking I could spend days or weeks, thousands of hours sort of visualizing the future of cities and the fate of civilization, all that kind of stuff. But nothing beats the power of the quick and dirty meme, right? Like the small, viral, sharp cartoon, or the thing that just really jumps off. And I guess the other preoccupation that I'm finding increasingly interesting is the idea of the web not as a broadcast medium, obviously, but as a collaborative medium where we all have audiences of our own. And if we can persuade each other to share our audiences with each other, we can communicate laterally in a way that's never really been possible before. So I guess that was sort of, it's my closing thought. As designers in various fields around the place, never forget the power of communication, the power of design. Sometimes it is ugly. What happened in Paris was ugly, and I think it's maybe kind of fitting to finish with that. The power of the image, the power of design, I think is probably greatly underrated in our society and in our work. Probably leave it there. I don't know if that was a totally incoherent ramble. If you're all expecting something else, please raise your hands. We'll give you your money back. Did they take money?